I'm excited now to be joined by two outstanding leaders in the world of HR, people and talent. With us today, we've got Sharon Whitehead, who is the Group Chief HR Officer, I had to practice that a few times, from Smurfit Kappa. If you don't know already, Smurfit Kappa is a global manufacturing company with 46,000 employees. She's on the board of CIPD. She had a 20-year career with Kerry Group prior to Smurfit Kappa, latterly as the Global VP of HR. And she joins us from here in Ireland. And we're also joined by Katie Burke, who's the Chief People Officer for Hubspot. And again, if you don't know Hubspot, they're a rapidly growing US tech company with 11 locations globally. They've about 4,000 employees or just over. Hubspot's one of those businesses with a brilliant reputation for employee experience and innovation. And during Katie's time, Hubspot have won the #1 best place to work as awarded by Glassdoor. And Katie joins us from Boston. So welcome. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Katie. Okay, Sharon, I'd like to start with you. Before I ask you a question, you've been described by people at Smurfit Kappa as a super professional, somebody who's approachable, visible, and an inspiration. The title of this discussion is whether this is the defining moment for the CPO as we rework a better working world. So I want to ask you, what's your take on this? You know, CPOs have led the most, enormous change program in the last 12 months, probably the biggest change in living memory. So is it the defining moment for the CPO? And if so, how do CPOs across the world ensure that the enhanced influence that they've gathered over the last 12 months, how do they ensure that that's sustained?
Thanks, Mike, and that's some introduction to live up to. I'm not sure who you were talking to in Smurfit Kappa, but
they sent me loads of money, so
nice to get the feedback. Is it the defining moment for CPOs? I certainly think it's a defining moment and a critical defining moment for CPOs. Anyone who works in the people profession in the past 1 to 2 years, I think, has definitely seen an acceleration, a shift, a change, a pull, a demand for all of our skills and services as we've tried to keep business as usual going, because I think that's always been very important, but also people who may not have looked up to us before for things like crisis management, for strategic thinking and so on, have certainly been looking up and expecting answers and solutions all the time. So it's been a great place to be for anyone working in the people profession in the last year, but also a very demanding space too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can imagine. Thank you for that. Katie, can I flip it over to you if I can? So I know that HubSpot has a great reputation in the media and the industry for its work in people and culture. It also seems, again, from a little bit of research that I've done, your personal authenticity, your openness, and your commitment to diversity and inclusion really shines through in that organization. So the same question, if I can, how do CPOs across the world sustain that influence? Because there's a future transformation that we've got to go through for many businesses. And so that journey for CPOs, how do they maintain that influence that they've gathered?
Yes, I completely agree with Sharon. I think it's a defining moment, perhaps not the defining moment. And I think one challenge that we need to talk about is I think people came into 2021 thinking 2020 was behind us. And sure enough, your team in lockdown our team is still in lockdown in Ireland. Most of the folks tuning in are still experiencing lockdown. And so I think it's kind of feels like more of the same. And so I think the trick is kind of twofold. One is sustained empathy, and two is sustained acknowledgement of the burnout and mental wear and tear. The reality is that CPOs are not just trying to carry the weight of the business, they're also carrying the weight of people's problems in the business as well. And so I think one thing we need to talk more about is the burden it creates for your team. So Sharon and I were just chatting before, and we were not talking about how we're doing personally, we're talking about how's your team, because they are literally the shock absorbers for the crisis in the organization, and they are taking on people's challenges and problems on a day-to-day basis. And so I think one thing, in addition to thinking about influence in the C-suite, we also need to make sure our teams are properly resourced for the future, because the reality is with talent as everyone's most precious resources, the demands will not go away for people teams globally.
Yeah, you make a really good point there, because I've obviously been doing a little bit of research into this as I've been thinking about how we approach this question. Leadership seems to keep coming up time and time again in terms of, obviously COVID for some businesses, for many businesses, I think it's been a real triumph for leadership. Organizations have had trust and engagement scores that have gone through the roof, which is brilliant to see. But obviously, as we think about what's next, and like you said, this is still ongoing, this is still a major challenge. It's the skills that you and your colleagues within HR departments around the world, bring to the leadership of those organizations that are going to define whether those organizations are able to thrive in the future, isn't it? And you mentioned one, empathy. That there seems to be a real proliferation of new skills that we need for leadership as we face the challenge.
I think you're exactly right. And I think, I didn't plan on visiting 4,000 people's homes this year. I don't think anyone did. I don't think Sharon did either. And so that comes with great power and great responsibility. And so when you absorb and employ human beings, you get connected with their families in a way that before you might not otherwise going into work every day. And that, I think, comes with a real responsibility to ensure we're taking on the whole of that mission. And that we take it really seriously. And so from my perspective, I feel fortunate to have been invited to 4,000 people's homes around the world. And at the same time, I feel an obligation to not just do right by our employees, but by their families as well.
Absolutely. Sharon,
if I could add just on the influence piece, because Katie and I were chatting before the call, I think it's really important, and we've got so many hundreds of HR professionals, I think, in our virtual call today. But there has been a very common experience in one regard to the pandemic and the impacts of the pandemic. But on the other side, I think every organization might have a uniqueness as well. And as HR professionals, I believe, and I would encourage any of us, if we want to continue to influence our leadership, to influence our people, as we move into this next phase of the pandemic, and hopefully the last phase of the pandemic as we're emerging into some form of new normal, is that, to influence, we've got to really understand it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So, for example, if we take Hubspot, your business model is completely different from Smurfit Kappa. The markets Katie serves and operates in are similar but different from some of the markets that we operate in Smurfit Kappa. And that difference is really important because there's so much thought leadership out there at the moment around the emerging place of work and the emerging requirements. And I think as HR professionals, if we just take those generic statements or trends and try and force them into our organizations, they may not be very relevant.
Yeah.
I think knowing your sector, knowing your people demographics, knowing what your business is trying to achieve is really, really important, that you localize that for your organization and for your leaders to really continue to influence, because we are moving from a phase of crisis management and response into a phase of really trying to thrive and progress and create whatever the future needs to look like, and it has to work for your particular sector and organization.
Absolutely. I heard a great phrase that, we're all in the same storm, but everybody's in a different boat. So that's one way of describing that. But doesn't that make the job of the CPO, the HR departments around the world, because the increased need and requirement for personalization, as workers, as employees, that makes your role infinitely more complex, doesn't it, Sharon?
It does, complex.
Yeah.
Complexity doesn't have to be impossible or difficult. I think one of our roles is to decomplex, and we've had to do a lot of this in the past 12 months, is to take something really big and simplify it for our leaders and for our organization and plan it out very simply so that it's effective. And I think we're going to have to keep decomplexing, whether it's through the lens of OD or whether it's through the lens of employee engagement. We've got to keep doing more of that.
Yeah. Katie, how are you dealing with that complexity piece and that increased requirement for personalization right down to each individual 4,000 people in HubSpot?
Yeah, so I think I would echo what Sharon said. I think this isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think the biggest mistake that people could make is to copy and paste what other organizations are doing and try to make it work. Your approach for the future work has to match your culture and your business strategy. And I also think that there's a little bit of expectation of personalization for 4,000 people. What I would say at Hubspot is we've picked 3 options. So we're going with a hybrid work model, and we're letting people work at the office, at Flex, or at home. And I always say to people that clarity is kindness. That's one of kind of our anchors as a people operations team. And so we're clear, you can't work anytime, anywhere. If you work on our customer support team, you can't just choose to work through the night and not log in during the day, sort of thing. There are parameters around which our future work principles are built. But within those parameters, you have a ton of flexibility as an individual. And so I actually think it's really important. One of the things we've done is our options are on our website. They're super clear. You pick them as part of the recruitment process. We've committed to this process for the next several years. So we're not going to flip the switch in 6 months. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important too, because candidates, when they're choosing HubSpot, are making a lifestyle choice. They're picking where their families are going to live. They're picking a commute. And so we need to make sure we really get that right. And so what we try to do is not say you can do anything anywhere. We try to be really clear and prescriptive about where you have flexibility and where you don't, and kind of the why behind what we're doing. And I completely agree with Sharon. I think it's our job to simplify really complex options and make them as transparent as possible, because by the time you get to an organization, if your expectations are off, there's a huge mismatch there. So you need to start it even before the recruitment process starts so that people are super clear what they're signing up for.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. That clarity is so important at the moment when people are dealing with so much other noise out there and outside of work, in their home lives and through media and whatnot. If the business can provide clarity and very clear guidelines of what's to be expected, that can really help those people experience a better place to work, kind of.
Absolutely. And I think when people are choosing, one of our recruiters in Dublin the other day shared with me that people are asking not just how are you handling COVID for the next 6 months, but what can I expect as an engineer in HubSpot in 2 years from now? And I want to understand, could I still have flexible work? Could I still come in just 3 days a week? Are others' expectations going to change? And so I think part of the job of the CPO is to think in longer time horizons. Crises are all about responding. Now our job is to switch from responding to a crisis to setting a vision for the future. And that vision has to be compelling, not just to current employees, but to future employees as well.
Very good. Just going back to leadership again for both of you. So I'm just really interested in this as a two leaders in this area. What skills are you starting to pivot towards with your leadership teams around what those individuals will need to help the business thrive as again, hopefully we start to move out of that kind of reactionary phase of dealing with COVID. Maybe Sharon, if you could take that first.
Sure. It's a good question, and we have done a piece of work internally, which is around what's the lessons learned over the past 12 months, and we started with our top 500 leaders. And within that, we haven't just asked what's the lessons learned in terms of policies or procedures or ways of working. We've asked it also through the lens of how they manage their people, and are they leading differently? And then what are they seeing as the real positives in that different shift or way of leading? And leading with empathy comes out number one all the time. And I don't mean to make it sound too soft, but the most strongest performance-driven leaders that we have are using this language and these words in the organization. And in a way, intellectually, they've always got that, but they've never had such an opportunity or a blank canvas by which to practice some of the skills we've been trying to develop them on over the years. We've had a wonderful year of performance in Smurfit Kappa. We're very fortunate. It's been a terrible year in other areas that, obvious downsides to the pandemic. But it has also shown the leaders that leading with the head and the heart means that you get this strong connection with your employees who will go the extra mile. In Smurfit Kappa, only about 10,000 of our 46,000 employees are able to work from home during the pandemic. we're a partner, a critical partner in the supply chain. So we've had to motivate, encourage, recognize 36,000 people to show up for work every single day as a critical partner to keep the supply chain going. And our leaders have played a key role in encouraging them to do that. And they've done that through real empathy, through rewarding non-financial, I'm talking about real recognition, creating purposeful work so that people really understand the reason behind what they're doing and the positive impact of the role that they're playing. And as a result of that, our leaders are saying, well, actually, our people are performing to a higher level of standard than they did before. So they've kept all the old kind of traditional ways of leading, and they've, accompanied it with some really positive new learnings. And they're very clear, how do we sustain and keep that into the new world?
Very good. That's brilliant. Fair play. Katie, over to you on that. So, the leadership qualities that HubSpot are looking for, or you think that the, business leaders need in general, hopefully as we start to move out of this, what do you think? Have they changed, or is it more of a evolution rather than a revolution?
I think they have changed. And so I would just echo, while Sharon and I run very different people orgs at very different companies, I would say the ethos of what makes leaders successful, I would plus one everything that she said. I would add to that list vulnerability. I think one thing that really came out during the pandemic was, remember the stage of the pandemic when everyone was baking banana bread and various breads, and it just felt like everyone was picking up a new hobby and everyone's kids were perfect and all that kind of stuff. And we had this interesting moment at HubSpot where we sort of realized, like, everyone is pretending everything is fine and it's just not. And so part of, I think, the real gift of vulnerability is just acknowledging that things are hard right now and really, really, really challenging for people. So our chief customer officer, Yamini Rangan, she at one point just said, I've had 2 kids at home. I'm homeschooling. My husband's home. We're working from home. There's so much going on. It's just not meant to be like this. This is incredibly hard, and I'm really feeling it. And you could almost hear a collective sigh on Zoom from people in their own respective homes going, oh, the standard isn't perfection. It's progress. Yeah. And just, I think, letting people in on your humanity goes a long way. The other thing I'll say is I think inclusion is becoming even more important as a value for leaders. So not just building diverse teams, but really thinking about how to make people feel as though they belong and that they're seen and valued in a remote world, I think is a new and different skill that's become even more important. And so echoing all of Sharon's points, I would add those 2 to the mix. And I would say they've become more important, and I actually think it'll stay that way. Very good. Yeah.
I think I agree. The vulnerability piece is so important, and I know, again, I know you've sort of walked that talk, Katie, in your own organisation. So brilliant, and actually bring me really nicely on when you mentioned inclusion there, because I know how important diversity and inclusion is to both of you individually and to your businesses. So I want to ask you, again, hopefully we're looking at a new dawn. We're looking at an opportunity to rebuild how businesses work now and how they sort of interact with society. How can your office of the CPO help an organisation become a force for good in a recovering market? Katie, maybe you take that first for me.
Sure. So I think it starts, by asking the ultimate question, which is everyone misses the warmth of an office, or at least I certainly do, in the connection with colleagues. But the traditional office experience doesn't serve everyone all the time. So a few examples. Folks who have abilities and accessibilities challenges, the workplace has always, I think, not been as welcoming as it could be to folks on that front. Folks in chronic pain, I think coming into the office and long commutes and that sort of thing, it hasn't felt super welcoming or inclusive. And I think for folks, this year has obviously been incredibly hard on caregivers. We see that in the number of women leaving the workforce globally, which is heartbreaking. There's an economic crisis happening in parallel with the health one. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, as we think about that return, what does that look like, and how can we make sure that the future of our workforce is more inclusive? And so I think that path forward is really, really critically important. And then I also just think it's asking harder questions about how we welcome new people into the workforce. So a good example is people who take a career break for caregiving have a really hard time getting back in, and reentry is a real challenge. So one of the things we're working on at HubSpot is we have something called the Returners Program, and we'd like to scale that even bigger so that people who take a career break to care for a parent, a child, or just to take a break and recharge for an illness or ability are welcomed back into the workforce with a seamless experience. And so I think those are some of the things that we're thinking about as we think about the future of work and inclusion. And I think it's really important that we not just flip the switch and return to the new normal, but ask those hard questions about who things are working for and why. Very
good. Yeah. Sharon, to you, how can Smurfit Kappa become a force for good in a recovery market, and how can you influence that from the Office of CPO?
I think if I touch on some of what Katie said, internally there's a lot we can do, and I'll talk about externally maybe in a minute as well, but internally there's so much more we can do. The obvious one that really calls out is inclusion and diversity, and I just think having more agile, flexible policies helps so many people in multiple diverse communities in so many ways, whether it's gender balance, whether it's having unbias in terms of your decision making on recruitment, promotion internally, and so on, because we're probably more focused now on outputs, not necessarily where a person's from, who they are, what they do. We've learned to measure and value performance very, very differently. If I look at externally to the organization, I think most companies now, and I know Smurfit Kappa is very focused at this, is we can impact society much, much more, and we can impact sustainability an awful lot more. From a societal perspective, I think most responsible organizations have helped their communities this year. And we have seen the need and the power of building stronger relationships and working with our communities. And I think that will go, if companies and organizations continue that, that will really help society as a whole, and will in turn help the businesses indirectly. And then on the other piece around sustainability, well, if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's don't mess with nature. It's pretty powerful. And when it goes wrong, or when it is on a run like it's on currently, it can have a massive, massive impact on the world, as we know it. And I think the focus on sustainability will just grow even further now as we try to protect nature and understand it a little bit more, because we've seen the downside in this past 12 months.
I think that is beautifully said, Sharon. I think one thing that's important to acknowledge that both of us were talking about before this started is just the gratitude we have for being growing companies. And so I think part of how corporations can give back to the community is by acknowledging that we are fortunate. And so one of the things that our Dublin office and Hubspot actually pioneered was something called the Gratitude Relay. So we finished the year strong, and we finished the year wanting to acknowledge and give back to local community partners. And so all of our leaders expressed gratitude for our team, and in doing so also made donations to local organizations in each of the entities where we operate. And I think just acknowledging that growing better as a corporation isn't just about growing your revenue numbers, but also about giving back to people, and also just acknowledging to people. I think millennials get a bad rap. We all know that. But I think one of the things that we see and really value in our employees for millennials is they want to make an impact on the world. And so I think the expectation to work for a corporation that takes things like sustainability and giving back seriously is going to become even more important in the future as it is now.
Yeah, because one of the questions I'm going to ask you now is about the kind of wins that we've had from COVID. And it sounds awful to say that, but there have been things, there's positives to bring out of this situation. So better understanding of wellness, both physical and emotional, the great effects of flexibility for individuals, and that increased awareness and activity on sustainability. How do we make sure we don't just slip back into the old way of doing things? And I'm kind of going to answer my own question here, sorry, but part of it is it's that global competition for talent is going to demand it, isn't it? And that's something we have to have our ears tuned into to make sure that we're sort of lining our businesses up to meet that requirement from the talent community. Katie, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, I'm happy to. So when the pandemic first started, there was this refrain going around within HubSpot that said, now that we can recruit people from anywhere, the world is at our feet. What can't we do? And it was my job to hold up a mirror and say, do you not realize that every other tech company is in the exact same boat we are? So competition's about to go up, not down.
Yeah.
And so I think one thing that's really important is just to call out the reality of the markets. When things opened up for us, so too did they open up for so many other growing tech companies that are competing for the same talent. And so what we tried to do is be strategic about where we can win and what we really care about in terms of our employee experience. So we know our culture of flexibility, we've always had a strong culture of autonomy and flexibility. We want to make sure our future work commitment reflects that. We know mental health is paramount. We're not going to wait for candidates to ask about it. We're going to talk about our commitment to mental health and well-being, and we're going to celebrate Are You OK Day and make sure people know, and that our hiring managers talk and normalize that. And then on inclusion, again, we're going to make sure we are best in class in the world at building a diverse and inclusive organization and at creating impact in the communities we operate in. And we're not going to wait for people to ask about those things. And we're going to, instead of resting on our laurels and saying things are going to be fine and we can afford to sit back, we're leaning in to say, how do we position ourselves to win the talent war in 2025? And I think that forward-thinking acknowledgement is really important. And I also think just not getting complacent is really important, because I think it's super easy to think, you know, one of the things I drive our team crazy on is every time we win an award, I say, you know who saw our award? Every single other talent competitor in the world. And so they are starting this morning saying, okay, we've got to catch those folks at HubSpot. And so we've got to be better next year than we were this year. And I hope our candidates and our employees feel that, because it's not a competition for the award. It is a competition for the hearts and minds of candidates. And I think we owe it to them to put our best foot forward.
Well said. Well said. Sharon, what about you? I mean, again, that requirement to sort of, you know, really sort of cement those wins, that you know, all the development that we've had, the good development as a result of COVID. How do we get that and make sure that's locked in and not just lost as things hopefully start to improve? Is it a talent thing for you as well? You know, is that the
it certainly will. Talent will be the core piece of it, and I do think HR will be the leaders and the drivers of ensuring that the best of COVID helps to grow and thrive in the new world. Talent today, more so than even the war on talent that existed pre-COVID, they have even more choices. Around where they work, who they work for, and we all have, you know, multi-generations working within our company. So in Smurfit Kappa, we have 5 generations. So we have really young, right up to over 70, working in our organization. And we've done a lot of work in the last 12 months to pulse our people through surveys and really understand what's their emerging expectations. And then we've tried to look at that through, again, markets and countries. We've looked at it through age and generation profiles so that we can make sure that we're relevant to all the generations that we have working for us today. And then we're taking an outside-in view, which is, well, how do we make sure that we can differentiate and be relevant to future potential talent coming into the group? I think Katie said something really important at the beginning, which is around being true to yourself or your organization. And, you know, for us, one of the things we're holding on to is we want to preserve our culture within Smurfit Kappa. We don't want to change it. We're okay to enhance it, absolutely. But we're trying to understand, with all the new changes, how do we continue to grow the culture that we already have? Whether it's a hybrid working, we've also got to make sure that we don't do something very beneficial for our office-based staff and not forget our 36,000 strong workforce on the front line that we need every single day, and getting the right balance. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all piece, but there has been some upside to COVID. We've put it into a framework called My Work in Smurfit Kappa. And in essence, it is a smart working concept. And we're talking about 4 areas. My meetings, our smart meetings, smart travel, smart office, and smart learning. And we have built a series of initiatives under, you know, how we can now do virtual meetings, but we do want face-to-face meetings from time to time. And we've set some targets and we've given some freedom within a framework around what that should look like for 22 and beyond. Smart travel is all around how we engage and collaborate with people, and you don't always have to hop on an airplane nowadays. You know, we've had a proof of concept and it works even in a traditional organization. Smart office is all around what are the roles that we can give more flexibility to, and how do we open the organisation to even more trust with our people. I know trust was talked about earlier on in the conference this morning. It's really powerful. And then smart learning is that blended learning approach between classroom and online. So we've tried to put a framework around it right through the lens of the talent. But I think meeting the talent needs and the business needs and trying to find the alignment between the two is really where the sweet spot will be.
Very good, very good. Listen, guys, I could go on for a while, but unfortunately we don't have time. That's been brilliant. I think just to conclude, I think you summed it up really well there, Sharon, when you said, that this is not a one-size-fits-all, solution. It's a very complex world we face into, but I think both of you have outlined how, CPOs and HR departments around the world are helping to declutter those decisions and hopefully give us a pathway forward. So thank you so much for joining me. Really, really appreciate it. It's been brilliant talking to you both, and we'll chat to you again soon.